Listen closely, dear, because what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your very core. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about betrayal that cuts deeper than any knife, about a mother's love that was trampled upon, and about justice that sometimes comes dressed as revenge. My name is Margaret. I'm 84 years old, and I'm about to share with you the most painful yet triumphant chapter of my life, a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty and a mother's resilience. Picture this. After 60 years of sacrifice, of putting my children before myself, of working my fingers to the bone to give them the best life possible, my own son, my flesh and blood, looked me in the eye and said, I smelled like death and needed to be locked away in a nursing home. Can you imagine the devastation, the humiliation, the complete shattering of a mother's heart? But here's the thing about us mothers, sweetheart. We don't stay down for long. What my son thought was the end of my story was actually just the beginning of his worst nightmare. You see, my boy thought he was dealing with a frail, defeated old woman who would quietly fade away in some sterile facility while he lived it up in the house I had worked 3 jobs to pay for. He thought I was too old, too sick, too broken to fight back. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this smelly old woman had been quietly building an empire while he was busy planning my disposal. Every tear I shed in that nursing home, every night I lay awake feeling abandoned and forgotten, I was plotting something that would turn his comfortable world upside down. The smell he complained about? It wasn't the smell of death, darling. It was the smell of chemotherapy, of radiation treatments, of a body fighting for its life while trying to shield her ungrateful children from the truth about her cancer diagnosis. But that's getting ahead of myself. What happened next will make your blood boil with righteous anger and then warm your heart with the sweet satisfaction of justice served cold. Because when I walked out of that nursing home 6 months later, I didn't just reclaim my dignity. I reclaimed everything he thought he had stolen from me, and then some. This isn't just a story about family betrayal, honey. This is a story about the power that lies dormant in every mother's heart, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It's about secrets that can destroy families, about inheritance that can disappear overnight, and about how sometimes the people who underestimate us the most are the ones who end up paying the highest price. So, buckle up, because this ride is going to take you through emotions you didn't even know you had, and by the end, you'll understand why they say you should never ever underestimate the fury of a mother scorned. Now, before I dive into this heart-wrenching tale that will have you on the edge of your seat, I need you to do something for me. If stories like this touch your soul, if you believe that every mother's voice deserves to be heard, then please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. But more importantly, I want you to leave a comment sharing one thing you've learned from your own mother, because when we share these stories, when we honor the women who raised us, we create a community of strength that can't be broken. Your comment might just be the encouragement another viewer needs to hear today, and together, we can build a family of listeners who understand that every story matters, every voice counts, and every mother's love, no matter how tested, deserves to be celebrated. I was born in 1940 in a small town outside of Cleveland, Ohio, into a family where love was scarce, but expectations were sky high. My father, Robert, was a factory foreman who believed children should be seen and not heard. And my mother, Ruth, was a seamstress who worked from dawn till dusk just to keep food on our table. We lived in a cramped 2-bedroom house with peeling paint and drafty windows. But it was home, and we made do with what we had. I was the middle child of 5, older sister Helen and brother James, then me, followed by twin brothers David and Michael. Being in the middle meant being invisible most of the time, which taught me early on to be self-reliant and observant. My childhood was spent helping Mother with her sewing, watching her delicate fingers work magic with needle and thread, transforming scraps of fabric into beautiful dresses for the wealthy ladies in town. She rarely spoke while she worked, but I learned to read her moods by the rhythm of her stitching, quick and precise when she was content, slow and deliberate when worry clouded her mind. Father worked long hours at the steel mill, coming home exhausted and covered in soot, with little patience for children's chatter or complaints. Discipline was swift and harsh in our household, and we learned quickly that tears were viewed as weakness. When I turned 16 in 1956, everything changed. Helen had married her high school sweetheart and moved to Detroit. James had enlisted in the army, and suddenly I found myself the eldest child at home, responsible for helping with the twins and managing the household, while Mother took on more sewing work to make ends meet. It was during this time that I met Thomas, a charming young man who worked as an electrician's apprentice and had the most beautiful blue eyes I'd ever seen. He was 19, confident in that easy way that young men possess, and he made me feel special in a way I'd never experienced before. Thomas would wait for me after school, walking me home with my books tucked under his arm, telling me about his dreams of starting his own electrical business someday. He spoke of marriage, of building a house with his own hands, of filling it with children and laughter. For a girl who had known little tenderness in her life, his words were like music. My parents, surprisingly, approved of the courtship. Father respected Thomas's work ethic and steady income, while Mother appreciated that he treated me with gentle courtesy, always standing when I entered a room and asking permission before taking my hand. We were married on a crisp autumn day in 1958, just 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. The ceremony was small, held in the local Methodist church with only immediate family present. I wore Mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Thomas had picked himself that morning. We couldn't afford a honeymoon, so we spent our first night as husband and wife in the tiny apartment Thomas had rented above Murphy's hardware store. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a shared bathroom down the hall, but it was ours, and I had never been happier. The early years of our marriage were filled with hope and hard work. Thomas labored during the day learning his trade while I took in sewing just as Mother had taught me, our small apartment becoming a workshop where I mended clothes and altered dresses for the local women. Every penny we earned went toward our dream of owning our own home and starting a family. We saved religiously, denying ourselves small pleasures, eating simple meals, and wearing our clothes until they couldn't be patched anymore. Thomas would come home each evening, his hands rough from handling wire and tools, and we'd sit at our small kitchen table planning our future, sketching house layouts on scraps of paper, and dreaming of the children who would one day fill those rooms. In 1960, our first son Daniel was born, followed by Christopher in 1962, and finally Susan in 1965. Thomas had by then started his own electrical contracting business, working 18-hour days to establish his reputation and build a client base. I continued sewing from home, now with 3 small children underfoot, managing to contribute to our family income while caring for our babies. We had moved into a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street. Nothing fancy but clean and comfortable, with a big backyard where the children could play safely. Daniel was always the responsible one, mature beyond his years, helping me with his younger siblings and showing an early aptitude for his father's trade. By the time he was 12, he was accompanying Thomas on simple jobs, learning to thread conduit and identify different types of wire. Christopher was our dreamer, always with his nose in a book, talking about becoming a doctor or lawyer someday. And Susan, our only daughter, was the light of our lives, a sweet-natured child who seemed to bring joy wherever she went. The children grew up in a house filled with love and stability that I had never known in my own childhood. Thomas and I were determined to give them everything we hadn't had, not material wealth, which we still couldn't afford, but emotional security, encouragement, and the absolute knowledge that they were cherished. We attended every school play, cheered at every baseball game, helped with homework around the kitchen table, and never went to bed without telling each child how proud we were of them. By the 1970s, Thomas's business had grown substantially. He now employed 6 electricians and had contracts with several major construction companies in the Cleveland area. We were finally able to move into a larger house in a better neighborhood, a beautiful 2-story colonial with 4 bedrooms and a proper sewing room for me. The children were teenagers by then. Daniel had started working part-time for his father. Christopher was excelling in his studies and had his sights set on Ohio State University, and Susan was involved in every school activity imaginable, from drama club to student government. Life was good, almost too good, as if we were tempting fate with our happiness. Thomas and I would sometimes look at each other across the dinner table, surrounded by our children's chatter and laughter, and marvel at how far we'd come from that tiny apartment above the hardware store. We had built something beautiful together, a family and a business that would provide security for generations to come. Thomas often spoke of passing the electrical company to Daniel someday, of watching our grandchildren grow up in the house we'd worked so hard to afford. But fate, as I would learn, has a cruel sense of timing. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning in October 1978 that our perfect world came crashing down. Thomas had left early that morning for a job at a new office building downtown. I was in my sewing room, working on Halloween costumes for the church festival, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional but gentle. A doctor from Cleveland General Hospital. There had been an accident, an electrical fire. Thomas had been rushed to the hospital with severe burns and smoke inhalation. I remember the drive to the hospital as if it happened yesterday, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, praying to God to let me find Thomas sitting up in bed with his usual smile, telling me the doctors were being overly cautious. But when I saw the grim expressions on the medical staff's faces, when they led me to a family room instead of directly to his bedside, I knew my prayers weren't going to be answered the way I wanted. Thomas lingered for 3 days, his body fighting with the same determination he'd shown in everything else he had ever attempted. I never left his side, holding his bandaged hand and telling him about the Children's Day at school, about the orders I'd received for Christmas dresses, about anything that might bring him comfort. Daniel, Christopher, and Susan took turns sitting with us, their young faces marked with a grief too heavy for their ages. On Thursday evening, as the sun was setting outside his hospital window, Thomas squeezed my hand one last time and slipped away peacefully. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, clients whose homes Thomas had wired, employees who had learned their trade under his patient guidance, neighbors who had known him as a kind and generous man. The church overflowed with flowers and testimonies to his character, but all I could focus on was the terrible emptiness in my chest, where my heart used to be. At 38 years old, I was suddenly a widow with 3 children to raise, and a business I knew nothing about managing. The weeks following Thomas's death were a blur of legal paperwork, insurance claims, and well-meaning visitors bringing casseroles and condolences. The electrical business, which had been thriving under Thomas's personal attention, began to falter without his leadership. Clients started looking elsewhere, unsure about working with a company run by a woman who had never held anything more complicated than a sewing machine. The employees, good men all, tried their best to keep things running, but they needed direction and decisions that I felt completely unqualified to provide. It was Daniel, just 16, but already showing his father's mechanical aptitude and natural leadership, who suggested I sell the business rather than watch it slowly collapse. The decision broke my heart. It felt like losing Thomas all over again, but I knew it was the practical choice. We sold to a larger electrical company that retained most of the employees, and I used the proceeds to pay off our mortgage and set aside money for the children's education. With the immediate financial pressure relieved, I threw myself into raising my children with the same determination Thomas and I had once shared. I expanded my sewing business, taking on more complex alterations, and even designing custom wedding gowns for brides throughout the Cleveland area. Word of mouth brought me steady work, and I discovered I had a talent for business that I'd never had the opportunity to explore before. Within 2 years, I had moved my operation from the spare bedroom to a small storefront downtown, with 3 part-time seamstresses working under my direction. Daniel graduated from high school and immediately began working full-time for the company that had bought his father's business. He was a natural electrician with an intuitive understanding of wiring and electrical systems that impressed even the most experienced workers. Christopher earned a full scholarship to Ohio State, where he studied pre-law with the same intensity he'd shown in high school. Susan blossomed into a beautiful and intelligent young woman, elected homecoming queen and valedictorian of her graduating class. The children were my entire world during those years. Every decision I made was filtered through what would be best for them. Every dollar I earned was invested in their futures. I attended Christopher's college graduation with tears of pride streaming down my face, knowing that Thomas would have been bursting with joy to see our son receive his law degree summa cum laude. When Susan was accepted to nursing school, I felt the same overwhelming pride and gratitude for the opportunities we'd been able to provide, despite our loss. Daniel married his high school sweetheart, Patricia, in 1985, and they moved into a house just 3 blocks from mine. Christopher joined a prestigious law firm in Columbus after graduation, specializing in corporate law and quickly making a name for himself in the legal community. Susan became a registered nurse and eventually a nurse practitioner, dedicating her career to caring for elderly patients in long-term care facilities. All 3 of my children had found success and happiness, building the kinds of lives Thomas and I had dreamed of for them. The 1990s brought grandchildren and a new chapter of joy to my life. Daniel and Patricia had 3 children, Robert, Jennifer, and Thomas Jr., named after his grandfather. Christopher married a fellow lawyer named Elizabeth, and they had twin boys, Michael and Matthew. Susan met and married a wonderful man named John, a social worker, who shared her passion for helping others, and they had 2 daughters, Emily and Sarah. My sewing business continued to thrive throughout these years. I had moved to a larger location and now employed 8 full-time seamstresses, designing and creating custom clothing for clients throughout northern Ohio. We specialized in wedding gowns and formal wear, but also did alterations and repairs for everyday customers. The business had become something of a local institution, passed down through word of mouth from mothers to daughters, from brides to their sisters and friends. I was content during this period of my life, surrounded by family and sustained by meaningful work. I had weathered the worst loss imaginable, and not only survived but thrived. My children were successful and happy, my grandchildren were healthy and bright, and I had built a business that provided both financial security and personal fulfillment. On Sunday afternoons, my house would fill with the sounds of family dinners, children laughing, adults discussing their work and dreams, the comfortable chaos of a family that truly enjoyed being together. But as the years passed, I began to notice changes in Daniel that concerned me. Success in his electrical contracting work had brought him financial prosperity, but it had also brought a certain arrogance that I found troubling. He spoke dismissively of people he considered beneath his station, made comments about carrying dead weight in society, and seemed to view money as the only meaningful measure of a person's worth. When I gently challenged these attitudes, he would laugh and tell me I was too old-fashioned to understand the modern world. Patricia, his wife, seemed to encourage these changes in him. She had grown up in a wealthy family and had never experienced the kind of financial struggle that Thomas and I had known. She made subtle comments about my little sewing shop, and suggested that perhaps it was time for me to retire and enjoy my golden years rather than continuing to work like a common seamstress. When I explained that I loved my work and had no intention of retiring, she would exchange glances with Daniel that made me feel foolish and stubborn. The real trouble began in 2015, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. At first, the family rallied around me with the same supportive love I had always known from them. Christopher researched treatment options and found me the best oncologist in Cleveland. Susan, with her nursing background, accompanied me to appointments and helped me understand the medical terminology and treatment protocols. Daniel and Patricia offered to help with whatever I needed during my recovery. The chemotherapy was brutal, more difficult than anything I had experienced since Thomas's death. The treatments left me nauseated, exhausted, and yes, sometimes producing odors that I couldn't control, despite my best efforts at personal hygiene. It was a side effect the doctors had warned me about, caused by the powerful chemicals coursing through my system as they fought to save my life. Most days I felt so sick I could barely get out of bed, let alone maintain the rigorous personal care standards I had kept my entire life. During this time, I was forced to close my sewing business temporarily. The chemotherapy made it impossible for me to concentrate on detailed work, and I didn't want to risk making mistakes on customers' precious garments. My employees were understanding and found temporary work elsewhere, with the promise that they could return when I was well enough to reopen. The loss of income wasn't a major concern. I had saved diligently over the years and had enough money to live comfortably, even without working. It was during my 4th month of treatment that Daniel first made the comment that would haunt me for years to come. I had dragged myself out of bed to attend my grandson Robert's high school graduation, determined not to miss such an important milestone despite feeling terrible. Daniel picked me up at my house, and as I got into his car, he wrinkled his nose and said, "Mom, you smell like death. Are you sure you should be going out in public like this?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I had showered that morning, used deodorant, brushed my teeth, and done everything possible to make myself presentable. But the chemotherapy had changed my body chemistry in ways I couldn't control, and sometimes, despite my best efforts, there were odors that I couldn't eliminate. I apologized quietly and rolled down the window, spending the entire ride to the graduation feeling ashamed and humiliated. That comment marked the beginning of a change in Daniel's behavior toward me that grew progressively worse over the following months. He began visiting less frequently, and when he did come by, he would stay only briefly, often standing near the door rather than sitting down. Phone conversations became shorter and more perfunctory. When I asked him directly if something was wrong, he assured me that he was just busy with work and that I was imagining things. Christopher and Susan, thankfully, remained as loving and supportive as ever throughout my treatment. Christopher drove up from Columbus every other weekend to check on me, bringing groceries and helping with household tasks I was too weak to handle. Susan called daily and often stopped by after her shifts at the hospital, bringing soup and sitting with me during the worst days. Their continued love and attention made Daniel's growing distance even more painful and confusing. By the spring of 2016, I had completed my chemotherapy treatments and was declared cancer-free. The relief was overwhelming, not just for me but for the entire family. I slowly began to regain my strength and energy, and by summer I was feeling well enough to consider reopening my sewing business. The prospect of returning to work excited me. I had missed the creative satisfaction of designing beautiful garments and the camaraderie of working with my skilled seamstresses. But just as I was beginning to feel like myself again, Daniel dropped a bombshell that shattered my newfound peace. He came to visit on a Sunday afternoon in late July, arriving alone without Patricia or the grandchildren. His demeanor was serious, almost businesslike, as he sat across from me in my living room and launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. "Mom," he began, "Patricia and I have been talking, And we're concerned about your ability to live independently. The cancer treatment really took a toll on you, and we think it's time to consider some alternatives that would be safer and more appropriate for someone your age and condition." I stared at him in confusion. "What kind of alternatives, Daniel? I'm feeling much better now. The doctors say I'm completely healthy." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We've been looking at some very nice assisted living facilities. Places where you'd have your own apartment, but also access to medical care and meals and housekeeping services. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore." The suggestion felt like a slap in the face. "This is my home, Daniel. Your father and I bought this house together, raised you children here. I'm not ready to give it up, and I certainly don't need to be taken care of like an invalid." His expression hardened slightly. "Mom, you have to be realistic. You're 76 years old. You just went through cancer treatment, and frankly, there are still some lingering effects that make it difficult for people to be around you. The smell issue hasn't completely resolved, and it's embarrassing for all of us." There it was again, the humiliation about the odor that I was still struggling to control completely. The chemotherapy had damaged my digestive system in ways that sometimes caused embarrassing side effects, despite my doctor's assurance that this would improve with time. I had been working with specialists to address the problem, but healing from cancer treatment is a slow process. "I'm working with my doctors on that issue," I said quietly. "They assure me it will continue to improve. It's not a reason to abandon my home and my independence." Daniel stood up abruptly. "Look, Mom, we're not asking you. We're telling you what's going to happen. Patricia and I have already put a deposit down on a very nice place called Sunset Manor. You'll have your own room, 3 meals a day, and professional care. We've scheduled a tour for next Wednesday." The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. I refused to consider the nursing home, and Daniel became increasingly aggressive in his insistence that I had no choice in the matter. He argued that I was being stubborn and unreasonable, that I couldn't see clearly how much my condition had deteriorated, and that the family couldn't continue to worry about me living alone in such a large house. What hurt most was his repeated references to the odor problem, as if that somehow defined my entire worth as a person. He spoke about it as if it were a moral failing rather than a medical side effect that I was actively working to resolve. The shame and humiliation were overwhelming, but underneath those feelings, a spark of anger was beginning to grow. After Daniel left that day, I called Christopher and Susan to tell them about the conversation. Both were appalled by their brother's behavior and assured me that they supported my right to live independently as long as I was able. Christopher, in his lawyer's voice, reminded me that no one could force me to move to a nursing home against my will unless I was declared mentally incompetent, which I certainly was not. But Daniel was nothing if not persistent. Over the following weeks, he launched a campaign designed to wear down my resistance. He visited frequently, sometimes accompanied by Patricia, always with new arguments about why Sunset Manor was the best option for everyone involved. He brought brochures and photographs of the facility, pointing out the beautiful common areas and describing the activities and services available to residents. When rational arguments failed to convince me, Daniel resorted to emotional manipulation. He spoke about how worried he was about my safety, how he couldn't concentrate at work knowing I might fall or have a medical emergency with no one around to help. He painted vivid pictures of me lying on the floor for days, unable to reach the phone, until someone finally found my body. These scenarios were designed to prey on my fears and guilt, and I'm ashamed to admit that they were somewhat effective. The final straw came in September 2016, when Daniel arrived at my house with 2 large men I didn't recognize. He announced that they were there to help pack my belongings because we were moving to Sunset Manor that afternoon. I was speechless with shock and outrage, but Daniel proceeded as if my consent was irrelevant. "I've already signed the paperwork, Mom," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Dr. Henderson agreed that this is the best option given your recent health issues, and the ongoing problems with your personal hygiene. Everything is arranged. I later learned that Daniel had somehow convinced my family doctor to sign a statement recommending institutional care, though Dr. Henderson later told me he had been misled about my actual condition and wishes. At the time, however, I felt completely powerless to resist what was happening. The men began loading my personal belongings into boxes, while Daniel supervised, directing them to pack only essential items and leaving behind most of my furniture and household goods. "The room at Sunset Manor is furnished," he explained when I protested. "You won't need all this stuff anyway." I watched in numb horror as my life was dismantled around me. Photo albums, Thomas's tools, my sewing supplies, the children's school projects I had saved for decades. Everything was sorted into piles of keep, donate, or throw away by people who had no understanding of their sentimental value. When I tried to intervene to explain the significance of certain items, Daniel brushed aside my concerns with increasing impatience. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. You can't take everything with you. You need to focus on the essentials and let go of all this clutter that's just weighing you down." The drive to Sunset Manor felt like a funeral procession, with me as the corpse being transported to my final resting place. Daniel drove while I sat in silence, staring out the window at the familiar streets of my neighborhood, wondering if I would ever see them again. The facility itself was attractive enough from the outside, a modern building surrounded by well-maintained gardens, but it felt like a prison to me. My room was small but clean, with a single bed, a dresser, a small table and chair, and a private bathroom. The window looked out onto the parking lot rather than the gardens, and the walls were painted an institutional shade of beige that seemed designed to avoid offending anyone, while also providing no comfort or warmth. Daniel helped me unpack my few belongings, chattering cheerfully about how convenient everything would be, how I wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning anymore. When he finally left that evening, I sat on the narrow bed and wept as I hadn't since Thomas died. The reality of my situation was overwhelming. I had been essentially kidnapped by my own son and imprisoned in this place against my will, all because of a medical condition that was beyond my control. The shame of the odor problem, which had already been devastating, was now compounded by the humiliation of being treated like a mental patient who couldn't make her own decisions. The first few weeks at Sunset Manor were the darkest period of my life since losing Thomas. The daily routine was mind-numbing. Meals at prescribed times in a cafeteria filled with elderly residents who seemed to have given up on life. Activities designed to keep us occupied rather than engaged. And long hours sitting in my room with nothing to do but replay the events that had brought me to this place. The other residents were kind enough, but many were dealing with dementia or serious physical limitations that made meaningful conversation difficult. I felt isolated and forgotten, like I had been written off as a burden that the family could now ignore with clear consciences. Daniel visited once a week, usually on Sundays, bringing updates about the grandchildren and assurances that I was adjusting well to my new living situation. During these visits, I pleaded with him to let me come home, promising that I would get whatever medical help was needed to address the remaining side effects from my cancer treatment. But Daniel had convinced himself that he was acting in my best interests, and my protests only reinforced his belief that I was unable to make rational decisions about my own care. "Mom, you're so much better here," he would say. "You have people checking on you around the clock, nutritious meals prepared for you, and activities to keep you engaged. At home, you were just sitting alone all day, getting more depressed and isolated." So, what Daniel didn't understand, or chose not to acknowledge, was that my depression and isolation were direct results of his treatment of me, not symptoms of some inevitable decline that came with age. I had been an active, independent woman with a successful business and a full social life before my cancer diagnosis. The changes in my circumstances were entirely artificial, imposed by his decision to treat me like an incompetent invalid, rather than a person dealing with temporary medical challenges. But here's what Daniel didn't know, what none of them knew. During those seemingly helpless months at Sunset Manor, I was planning something that would change everything. You see, while I had been forced to close my sewing business during cancer treatment, I had never formally dissolved the company. And during the long, quiet hours in my nursing home room, I had plenty of time to think about business opportunities that I had never previously considered. I had always been good with money. Thomas and I had built our modest fortune through careful saving and wise investments over the years. But I had never been aggressive about growing that wealth because I was content with having enough to live comfortably and provide for my children's needs. Now, however, I had both the motivation and the time to explore more ambitious financial strategies. Using the small computer that Christopher had brought me to help pass the time, I began researching investment opportunities and business acquisitions. I opened new investment accounts with online brokers, something I never would have considered doing before my forced retirement. I studied market trends, read financial news, and educated myself about sectors that were experiencing rapid growth. But most importantly, I began buying up property. Not just any property, but strategic real estate acquisitions that would give me leverage over the people who had wronged me. I discovered that Daniel's electrical contracting business, which had grown substantially over the years, operated out of a building that he rented rather than owned. The property had recently come up for sale, and I quietly purchased it through a limited liability company that couldn't be traced back to me. I also learned that Patricia's family business, a chain of high-end clothing boutiques that had been in her family for generations, was struggling financially due to changing retail trends and online competition. They had taken out several loans using their commercial properties as collateral, and those loans were coming due at a time when their cash flow couldn't support the payments. I began acquiring those debt instruments from the banks, becoming their creditor without them ever knowing it. These financial maneuvers required most of my liquid assets, but I had enough savings to live comfortably for years even after making these investments. More importantly, I was no longer a powerless victim sitting in a nursing home room, feeling sorry for herself. I was a woman with a plan, and every day that passed brought me closer to the moment when I would reveal exactly how much power this smelly old woman actually possessed. The transformation in my attitude was noticeable enough that the nursing staff commented on it. I became more social, participating in activities I had previously avoided, striking up conversations with other residents, and even volunteering to help with some of the facility's administrative tasks. To outside observers, it probably looked like I was finally accepting my situation and learning to make the best of it. In reality, I was simply no longer consumed by helpless rage and despair because I knew my current circumstances were temporary. Daniel, during his weekly visits, was pleased by what he perceived as my improved outlook. "I told you this place would be good for you, Mom," he said during one visit. "You seem so much happier and more engaged than you were at home." I smiled and nodded, letting him believe whatever made him comfortable. Inside, I was counting down the days until I could show him exactly how wrong he had been about everything. The opportunity I had been waiting for came in March 2017, almost exactly 6 months after I had been forced into Sunset Manor. Daniel's lease on his business property was coming up for renewal, and as the new owner, I had the right to either renew his lease or terminate it. Similarly, the loans against Patricia's family business were coming due, and as the holder of those debts, I could either extend the payment terms or demand immediate full payment. I decided it was time to make my move. My friends, before I continue with the most satisfying part of my story, the moment when everything changed and justice was finally served, I need to pause and ask something of you. If this story has touched your heart, If you're feeling the same righteous anger I felt during those dark months, then please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. More importantly, I want you to scroll down to the comments and share your own thoughts about family loyalty and standing up for yourself when others try to tear you down. Your words of support and encouragement don't just help this channel grow, they create a community of people who understand that every person, regardless of age, deserves dignity and respect. And who knows, your comment might be exactly what another viewer needs to read today to find the strength to stand up for themselves in their own difficult situation. On a Tuesday morning in late March, I called Daniel's office and asked him to come see me at Sunset Manor that afternoon. I told him I had something important to discuss about my living arrangements, which was true enough. He arrived looking pleased, probably assuming I was ready to admit that he had been right about the nursing home being the best place for me. "What did you want to talk about, Mom?" he asked, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside my bed. I reached into my nightstand drawer and pulled out a manila folder containing documents I had been preparing for weeks. "I wanted to discuss your lease renewal, son." Daniel looked confused. "My lease renewal? What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and handed him the first document, the deed showing that I now owned the building where his electrical contracting business was located. I watched his face change as he read the paperwork, confusion giving way to shock and then to something approaching panic. When did you buy this building?" he stammered. "About 4 months ago," I replied calmly. "Right around the time you were telling everyone how I smelled like death and needed to be locked away for my own good." The color drained from his face as the implications began to sink in. His business employed 15 people now, and moving to a new location would be enormously expensive and disruptive. Worse, commercial real estate suitable for an electrical contracting operation was in short supply in our area, and rents had increased dramatically over the past few years. "Mom, surely we can work something out. I mean, you're not seriously going to evict your own son's business, are you?" I handed him the second set of documents, the loan papers showing that I now held the mortgages on Patricia's family's clothing stores. "Actually, Daniel, I'm more concerned about Patricia's family business right now. Did you know they're in serious financial trouble? These loans are coming due next month, and I don't see any way they can make the payments." Daniel's hands were shaking as he looked through the paperwork. "You can't do this, Mom. You can't destroy our family's businesses just because you're angry about living here." "Can't I?" I asked mildly. "I'm just a confused old woman who smells like death, remember? Maybe I don't understand what I'm doing. Maybe I'm making these business decisions because my brain is addled by age and illness." The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent months arguing that I was incompetent to make decisions about my own living situation, but now he was appealing to me as a rational businesswoman who should consider the consequences of my actions. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to go home," I said simply. "I want to live in my own house, manage my own affairs, and be treated with the respect that any human being deserves. I want you to stop treating me like a burden and start treating me like your mother." Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents spread across my bed. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part anger, part admiration, part fear. "You planned all this," he said. "While we thought you were just sitting here feeling sorry for yourself, you were planning this whole thing." "I had plenty of time to think," I replied, "and plenty of motivation to find a way out of the situation you put me in." The negotiation that followed was brief and to the point. Daniel would help me move back to my house immediately, and he would never again suggest that I needed institutional care unless I specifically requested it. In return, I would renew his lease at a reasonable rate and work out a payment plan for Patricia's family that would allow them to keep their business. But I wasn't quite finished yet. "There's one more thing, Daniel. I want you to apologize, not just to me but to the staff here at Sunset Manor, for the way you spoke about my medical condition. I want you to acknowledge that the side effects from cancer treatment are not a moral failing or a reason to treat someone as less than human. This was perhaps the hardest part for him, because it required acknowledging that his behavior had been cruel rather than just misguided. But with his livelihood hanging in the balance, he had little choice but to comply. That afternoon, in front of the nursing staff who had witnessed my deterioration over the past 6 months, Daniel publicly apologized for his insensitive comments about my medical condition and admitted that he had made a mistake in forcing me to leave my home. The vindication was sweet, but not as sweet as packing my belongings and walking out of Sunset Manor that same evening. Christopher and Susan were waiting for me when I arrived back at my house, having driven up from Columbus and Toledo respectively, as soon as I called them with the news. They had spent the day cleaning and preparing the house for my return, stocking the refrigerator and making sure everything was exactly as I had left it. "Mom, how did you manage all this?" Susan asked as we sat in my kitchen that evening, sharing a bottle of wine and catching up on everything that had happened. I told them about the months of research and planning, about the property acquisitions and debt purchases, about the quiet satisfaction of turning the tables on someone who had underestimated me completely. They were amazed by the complexity of what I had accomplished, but more than that, they were proud of me for refusing to accept defeat. "I can't believe Daniel thought he could just warehouse you in that place and forget about you," Christopher said, shaking his head. What was he thinking? "He was thinking that I was old and sick and powerless," I replied. "And he was wrong on all counts, except the age part." The fallout from my dramatic return home extended far beyond just Daniel and Patricia. Word of what had happened spread quickly through our social circle, and the reaction was fascinating to observe. Some people were shocked by what they saw as my ruthless manipulation of family relationships, but many more were impressed by my refusal to be victimized and my clever use of financial leverage to reclaim my independence. My story became something of a legend among the women in my age group, many of whom had their own experiences with adult children who seemed eager to take control of their lives and assets. I began receiving calls and visits from women who wanted advice about protecting themselves from similar situations, and I was happy to share what I had learned about maintaining financial independence and legal autonomy in old age. The relationship with Daniel was strained for several months after my return home. He was embarrassed by how the situation had played out and resentful about being outmaneuvered so completely. But gradually, as he saw that I was indeed capable of living independently and managing my own affairs, his attitude began to change. The side effects from my cancer treatment continued to improve, just as my doctors had predicted, and within a year they were completely resolved. More importantly, Daniel began to see me as a person again, rather than just a problem to be managed. Our conversations became more respectful, and he started seeking my advice about business decisions, rather than assuming I was too old to understand such matters. It wasn't the same easy relationship we had enjoyed before my illness, but it was based on mutual respect, rather than his condescending paternalism. Patricia took longer to come around, probably because she was more embarrassed than Daniel about the financial rescue of her family's business. But eventually, she too began to treat me with the courtesy and consideration that had been missing from our interactions during my illness. The grandchildren, who had been largely kept away from me during my time at Sunset Manor, resumed their regular visits and seemed genuinely happy to have their grandmother back in her own home. I did eventually reopen my sewing business, though on a smaller scale than before my illness. The months of forced retirement had given me time to think about what I really wanted to do with the remaining years of my life, and I decided to focus on custom work for special occasions, rather than trying to maintain a large operation with multiple employees. This allowed me to continue exercising my creative talents, while also having more time to spend with family and pursue other interests. One of those interests became financial consulting for older women who wanted to protect their assets and independence. I offered workshops through the local senior center on topics like estate planning, investment strategies, and legal rights for elderly people. It was immensely satisfying to help other women avoid the kind of manipulation I had experienced, and I discovered that I had a real aptitude for teaching these subjects. The property investments I had made during my time at Sunset Manor continued to perform well, providing additional income that allowed me to be even more generous with my family while still maintaining my own financial security. I was able to contribute substantially to my grandchildren's college funds and help Christopher and Susan with various family expenses without compromising my own independence. Looking back now, 8 years after that terrible period, when I thought my life was effectively over, I can see that it was actually a turning point that led to some of the most fulfilling years of my life. Being forced to confront my own vulnerability and powerlessness motivated me to develop skills and resources I never would have explored otherwise. The woman who walked out of Sunset Manor in 2017 was stronger, smarter, and more determined than the woman who had been forced into it 6 months earlier. Daniel learned some valuable lessons from the experience as well. He became much more involved in planning for his own old age, making sure that he had legal protections in place to prevent anyone from making decisions about his care without his consent. He also became an advocate for elderly rights in our community, supporting legislation that would make it more difficult for family members to force unwilling relatives into institutional care. The odor that had been used to justify my imprisonment, that humiliating side effect of life-saving medical treatment, became a symbol of something much larger in my mind. It represented all the ways that society devalues and discards people who are perceived as no longer useful or attractive. My refusal to accept that treatment and my success in fighting back against it felt like a victory, not just for me personally, but for all the elderly people who are written off and marginalized by their own families. Today, at 84, I live comfortably in my own home, surrounded by the possessions and memories that give my life meaning. I still drive my own car, manage my own finances, and make my own decisions about my medical care and living arrangements. The business ventures I started during my darkest period continue to thrive, providing both income and intellectual stimulation. Most importantly, I have the respect of my family and the satisfaction of knowing that I never gave up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. The young women who work for me now in my sewing business often ask for advice about planning for their own futures, and I always tell them the same thing. Never give up control of your finances. Never stop learning new skills. And never let anyone convince you that age or illness makes you less worthy of dignity and respect. The power to shape your own destiny doesn't disappear when you turn 65 or 70 or 80. It only disappears when you surrender it. My story isn't unique, unfortunately. Every day, elderly people are being manipulated, controlled, and discarded by family members who see them as burdens rather than human beings deserving of love and respect. But my story proves that it's never too late to fight back, never too late to reclaim your power, and never too late to remind the people around you that you're still here, still valuable, and still capable of surprising them. The smell that Daniel complained about, that medical side effect that was used to justify treating me like I was already dead, is long gone now. But if I had to choose between smelling like death and feeling dead inside, I know which one I'd pick. Because sometimes the people who think they're burying you are actually just planting seeds for your comeback. And let me tell you something, dear friends, my comeback was sweeter than any revenge I could have imagined. Because it wasn't just about getting even with Daniel or proving a point about respecting your elders. It was about reclaiming my own life, my own power, and my own worth as a human being. It was about refusing to be discarded like a piece of garbage just because I had the audacity to get old and sick. Every time I sit in my sewing room now, working on a beautiful wedding gown or helping a young bride feel confident and beautiful on her special day, I think about that dark period when I thought my useful life was over. Every time I review my investment portfolio or make a business decision, I remember the people who thought I was too confused and incompetent to manage my own affairs. And every time my grandchildren visit and we sit together in the garden that Thomas and I planted so many years ago, I'm grateful for the strength that carried me through those dark months and brought me back to this life I love. The nursing home experience taught me something valuable about the difference between being old and being obsolete. Age is just a number. It's the accumulation of years, but it doesn't define your worth or your capabilities. Being obsolete is a choice, a surrender to other people's expectations and limitations. I may be 84 years old, but I refuse to be obsolete, and I hope my story inspires other women my age to refuse that label as well. My dear friends, as we come to the end of this incredible journey together, I want you to know how much it means to me that you've listened to every word of my story. In a world that often dismisses the voices of older women, you've given me the gift of being truly heard, and for that, I am eternally grateful. If my experience has taught you anything about the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for yourself, or the value of never giving up hope, then sharing it has been worthwhile. But now I need something from you. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us who refuse to be silenced, diminished, or forgotten. If it touched your heart, if it made you think differently about the elderly people in your own life, or if it simply reminded you that every person deserves dignity regardless of their age, then please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. More than that, though, I want you to use the comments section below to share your own stories. Tell us about the older women in your life who have inspired you. Share your thoughts about how we can do better at respecting and valuing our elders. Let us know what lessons you've learned from your grandmothers, your mothers, your aunts, the women who paved the way for all of us. Because when we share these stories, when we honor these voices, we create a community that understands that age brings wisdom, not worthlessness. And if you're watching this as a younger person, thinking about your own future, remember this: the way we treat our elderly today is the way we'll be treated when we're old. The respect we show, the dignity we preserve, the voices we listen to. These things matter not just for them, but for all of us. Because if we're lucky enough to live long lives, we'll all be old someday, and we'll all hope that someone cares enough to listen to our stories. Thank you for being part of my family here, for giving me a place where my voice matters, and for reminding me that every story, no matter how old the storyteller, has the power to change hearts and minds. Until next time, remember that you're never too old to start over, never too weak to fight back, and never too forgotten to make a difference.